Hi everybody, Tom here. I am making this video as a bit of background help on essay writing in general, but also on the purpose of essay writing, which is something that you'll need to keep in mind for the final assessment. Now, I'm going to do three things in this video. I'm going to first of all talk about what an essay is and how you should approach one. Secondly, I'm going to talk a little bit about what makes philosophy essay writing specific, so what's different about philosophy essay writing than other subjects. There are important differences, but the differences are quite specific and they might not be as broad as you might think, so that's potentially important as well. And then finally what I'm going to do is very briefly go through the essay questions, kind of contextualizing what I'm talking about here at the beginning with what you actually have to do in 3-4 weeks or whatever it is. So this might go for a while. It's very windy and freezing cold out here, so I'll try and keep it short, at least so that you can hear me. But it's still going to go for a while because there's a bit of content to cover. Some of this, especially at the beginning, is probably going to be familiar to some people. That should not give you, pardon the bells, that should not give you incentive to switch off. This video will be important for a lot of people, but for all people, this video will matter in the sense that it might not change your mark by 2 letter grades, but it's going to change your mark. If you listen to what I have to say here and incorporate some of it into your essay writing for the final assessment, it's going to help. So, listen. Or don't. No, I'm not here to force you to do anything. This is, I think, helpful. This is what I'm doing just to try and help you guys out. So, the first thing to keep in mind when you're approaching an essay, any essay, is what the purpose of an essay is. Because if that's not at the forefront of your mind, then you're not going to be able to approach it correctly, and you're just going to have stuff going in all directions. You need to understand the purpose of an essay so that you can focus down on that, and then structure the whole paper around it. Otherwise, writing essays is going to be a nightmare. So, what's the purpose of an essay? So an essay is a written piece of communication at its most basic level. You're communicating something with the reader. What is it that you're communicating? The main thing that you're doing in a paper, the most important thing you're doing, in fact the only important thing you're doing in a paper, is presenting a thesis and making an argument for it. So an essay is a piece of writing that communicates something, and what it's trying to do, what it's communicating, is an argument for something. The point of an essay is that it's a persuasive piece of writing. That's the entire point. You're trying to persuade the reader of the either plausibility, factuality, correctness, whatever, of your thesis claim. Your thesis claim is the single sentence, the main thing that you're arguing for in the paper. You always have to have a thesis claim. If you don't have a thesis claim, and this is a major issue in undergraduate papers generally, then your paper's going to be all over the place. It's going to be very hard to interpret, it's going to be very hard for you to structure, not just in a simple kind of putting stuff in a correct order way, but approaching things in a logical, coherent way. So one of the feedback pieces that most people get is things in longer form essays, is things like, I can't follow the argument thread here, I can't see the logic, I don't understand what's happening, it's just jumping around too fast, I don't understand the connection. Almost always the reason for that in the writing is because the thesis isn't clear either to the student or isn't made clear to the reader if the student does have it in mind. The biggest thing to keep in mind is what your thesis claim is. Your thesis claim, as my Corbin Guide to Essay Writing thing, I put up a couple of weeks, I'm sorry about the wind, hopefully you can hear me, is something concrete. So I've said in there that it's either a yes, no, or yes with caveats. But as long as it's concrete, then that's what you should be focusing on. It has to be short, concise. If it takes longer than a breath to say, throw it out the window. Your explanation of your thesis can be quite long. In fact, it should be long. The point of your thesis claim, the thesis sentence, isn't that your reader will instantly understand everything. It's the kind of focal point for everything else. You then have to explain what you're actually talking about and then make the argument for it. But you have to have a very short, clear thesis claim. Now, it doesn't matter if it's a 2,000 word paper, 10,000 word paper, a book, a thesis. I know thesis/thesis is a bit confusing, but a written thesis. It still has to have a short, kind of punchy one sentence thing. So that will be something along the lines of, the most common ones you see is, I disagree with such and such's claim. It's just very factual, very kind of straight and punchy. Then you go on and say, such and such's claim is this. In this paper I will be arguing against this by, or whatever I said, arguing for this by such and such. So keeping in mind that an essay is a persuasive piece of writing, or it should be a persuasive piece of writing, what you're doing in the context of the paper is making an argument that persuades the reader of your thesis claim. That's what everything's going to be judged by. That's why an introduction is so important. Conclusions are a bit less important, but introductions are very, very important because they give the reader the tools, right? The tools the reader needs to evaluate what you're saying. So when they get to your body, and when they get to section 2 or whatever, paragraph 3, they're going, well, why is she talking about this? What's going on here? In the introduction you've said, this is the thesis claim. And then you've expanded that and said, this is how I'll be arguing for it, and this is why these things matter for the thesis claim. That tells me what's going on. That gives me the evaluative tools. Because if the introduction doesn't do that, and then you start talking about whatever, Friedman or whatever, then I'm going to, what's Friedman doing here? It's not, and the point of an essay isn't just to explain various stuff. Explanations only matter in as much as they support your argument. So you shouldn't be trying to explain all of Friedman or whatever. You should be trying to make your own argument and making other people's arguments work for you. At no point should the reader think they're reading just a summary of Friedman. If I wanted to read a summary of Friedman, I'd read Friedman's paper. I'm not reading Friedman's paper. I'm reading whoever, Amy's paper. I want to read Amy's argument. I never want to think that I'm confusing the two. It's all about Amy or whoever. So that is, I know that this might seem basic. For some of you who are coming from a more accounting background, this might not seem basic. This might be the first time you're hearing this. In which case, good, because this is going to matter. The point of an undergraduate essay, a lot of undergraduates get confused and they think the point of an undergraduate essay is to show how much knowledge they have, just to show explanations of stuff and solutions to all sorts of stuff. That's not what you do. I mean, the reader's not going to be able to understand it anyway, but that's just missing the point of what an essay actually is. It's a persuasive piece of writing. You're persuading the reader about one very simple claim. I disagree about whatever. All of the essay questions have a part of their questions which will give you the thesis claim. So you don't have the essay questions for this. In some subjects they're quite confusing. In this one they're very direct. However, making sure that you interpret the question correctly so that you're answering, or your thesis claim is appropriate, is important. But I'll go through that in a minute. So, an essay is a persuasive piece of writing. So that means a few things. One is you have to have that extremely clear in your head. So before you start writing, you need to isolate exactly what your thesis claim is. It can be, should be pretty simple because it's coming out of the question. So that's the important thing. The next thing, before you start writing, has to be your argument. So you need to have a picture in mind of what your argument is going to be. So, what's an argument? How do you persuade your reader? There is multiple ways of doing this, but there's one standard way. The standard way is you go from common, generally accepted principles, or whatever, common ground of some sort, and you narrow down, and you take your reader from something that we both agree on, down to your specific thesis claim. So you want to say you've got 3 sections. Most papers have 3 sections. 3 is a magic number. It doesn't have to have 3 sections, but I'll talk about 3. First one is going to be typically one of 2 things. So when you're in the literature, you'll see this very common, very often. The first section, the first thing they do is either a literature review or it's an empirical study, even in philosophy. The reason for that is what we're doing there is just pointing out facts in the world. We're situating our argument within a context of something and saying, look, we both agree on this, right? This is just a fact. It's true that, whatever, BP shoots dolphins for fun, or whatever the empirical case is. This was studied this was explored in a court case, whatever. This is just a fact. So you're situating something, so what we're interested in is BP, so you're narrowing down to your thesis claim. If your thesis claim is BP's actions were morally impermissible regarding dolphins. First thing is setting up the empirical facts of the case. It doesn't have to be like this. I'm just trying to illustrate that the common ground starting off is the important part. Then the second part, you move into perhaps the conceptual analysis part. You might say, well, shooting dolphins It seems prima facie bad, but there's no such thing as bad in itself. We need to have a framework for understanding what badness is. So one way we might look at that is through deontology. Kant says that shooting dolphins is bad for whatever reason. And then so that's moving down even further, and you're trying to show your readers, look, this isn't my argument, this is just deontology. Deontology says this, right? This is facts we can both agree on. We're both reasonable people. We're taking them down we're taking them down a set of train tracks, ideally, that forces them to agree with you. Then at the end you say, well, we've seen all this deontological stuff, and you want to complicate that a little bit by giving the reader reasons for thinking that deontology applies. But then you want to say, well, if we go back to the facts of the case and we explore dolphin killing and whatever, we can see that the actions of BP were morally impermissible, or whatever thesis claim might say. So you see how that narrows down. So you start off broad. We both agree on this. Then you narrow down, you narrow down, you narrow down. So you have steps, very clear steps. So what I suggest you do in these, you have to have steps. So what you don't have to have is subsections for these steps, but I really strongly recommend it. So I strongly recommend it because it makes reading papers much easier, and you want your paper to be as readable as possible. But it also makes it easier for you to write. So when you've got subsections, a subsection is just a mini essay. So you've got an introduction, a body, and conclusion. In the introduction, you're saying what's happening in that subsection, and also, perhaps more importantly, why it matters for the thesis. Here we will see whatever facts relating to dolphin killing. This is important for us to do because that's what we're interested in, or whatever. Something that relates it back to the thesis claim. You always need to say, there's two question marks. There's always, the first one is, what's happening? You need to explain to the reader what's actually happening. And the second question mark is, why are you doing this? Why are you telling me this? You need to tell me, or your reader, in any subject, and this is not philosophy specific, I teach in political science and stuff as well, this is the same stuff. You need to explain to your reader why you're saying what you're saying. So in a subsection, you're saying, this is what I'm saying here, this is why I'm saying it. Then you've got the body, which is the argument for whatever premise or whatever step you're doing there. And then a conclusion which sums it up and connects it to the next stuff. Saying, now that we've seen whatever, it's important that we see whatever, because whatever relationship to the thesis, right? So it's two question marks, what and why. So having subsections is a really easy way to set out your paper in that way. I've already explained why introductions are really important. When you're talking about explanatory, when you're talking about, for instance, if you're going to bring Kant into that, or dolphins or whatever, it's crucial that you're not approaching it from the perspective of, I need to give a summary of everything. It's not your job to give a summary of everything. You're not expected to understand the history of Western philosophy or the history of dolphin philosophy. You're expected to make an argument. So the way, you might be evaluated on explanation, I think you are in the rubric, but the way to do that is by using frameworks, whatever the literature says, appropriately in your own argument. That's the way to do it. Say, Kant says this, and this is why it matters for this. Your own argument. Hopefully that's clear. The point that is really important that you take home is that an essay is a persuasive piece of argument, and the thing you're persuading your reader about is your thesis. Persuasion, thesis. Thesis is the only thing that matters. If you're writing something, it should always be in the forefront of your mind, why does this matter for my thesis? Also, and then you should follow that up quickly by saying, have I told my reader that? Does my reader know why it's important? Because if they don't, then they're not going to be able to evaluate it. So that, very broadly, 13 minutes in, but that's basically what an essay is and what you need to keep in mind when you're writing an essay. So what's different about philosophy essays than non-philosophy essays? Well, not actually as much as you might think. One thing is that we care about argument more just by the nature of who we are. But the other thing is that we're not that interested in facts. We're interested in facts, but only in as much as it allows us to get to the conceptual territory underneath. So, for example, dolphin facts, you do not, there might be a bunch of empirical stuff you can talk about in that regard. It's pretty easy to establish dolphin facts in a philosophy essay. If it was a political science essay, it'd be much harder. It would matter where you were getting your resources from, UN study on dolphins or whatever, and then you'd have to compare that with someone else, and you'd have to justify that factual empirical work was justified. Philosophers don't really care about that. We're pretty happy to accept that dolphins get shot, or whatever. I shouldn't be using this example, but whatever you're talking about, I'm trying to suggest that it doesn't matter what you're talking about. This is just a kind of a cookie cutter approach, perhaps, but it doesn't matter what you're talking. It's always going to have the same elements to focus on. So if you're talking about some empirical thing, philosophers are pretty happy to accept that. If you're talking about, say, exploitation in the workplace, it would be important to potentially, depending on how you structure your argument, it's probably important to bring in some empirical work that says exploitation happened here. The reason that that's important, though, is to give your argument something to latch onto, something you can keep coming back, some thread that you can keep talking about. In a different paper, if it was an accounting paper, you'd have to talk about all sorts of stuff regarding empirical facts about exploitation, psychological studies, all that jazz. We're happy. Philosophers, I know exploitation happens. You don't have to prove to me that exploitation happens. The thing we care about is the morality of exploitation. So you want to introduce your empirical stuff and then just move on. As soon as possible. Just, this is what happens. Set up your argument framework, say this is what we're interested in. So, and you can keep going back to it, but you don't need to go through everything. You don't need to go through all that empirical work. So if you're spending time on that, like word space time, evaluate why you do it. Okay? So you've got a thesis, but the thesis is going to be morally based. It's going to be conceptual. It's going to be philosophical. The way that you persuade me about the plausibility of your philosophical thesis is not going to be empirical work. Empirical work might matter, but that's not going to be the basis. So getting into the conceptual territory, talking about the way the literature, the week's readings and stuff matter for that. So that's the main thing that matters. Apart from that, I mean, the difference obviously in terms of what we're interested in morality, whereas political science isn't going to be interested in morality, or to the same degree. So there are those kind of differences. But in terms of when you're writing an essay, that's the main difference. Apart from that, I mean, they're very, very similar to other subjects. So hopefully that's clear. That's the thing to focus on. If you're talking about talking about empirical work for a long time, that might be appropriate, but you need to make sure that you have a good reason for it and your reader knows what that reason is. This all comes back to the first part, which is an essay is a persuasive piece of writing, and you're persuading the thesis. So now I just want to jump into the sorry, I'm working behind you. The essay questions. I'll go through the rubric later. This video is long enough anyway. The rubric's good for, especially late, not as late as proofreading, but making sure you're on the right track. So essay questions are more important. So it's worth 40%, 1,800 words, give or take 10%, not including references. Your essay must incorporate a detailed discussion and analysis, 2 readings. You guys can read that in your own time. You have to answer one of the questions. So we'll go through these and I'll just identify what it's asking and how to think about your thesis in relation to it. Think about persuasion in relation to it. So you have to answer one. Do not try and answer more than one. So first, what moral obligations do corporations have to the various stakeholders in a firm, including to society more generally? Answer this question with reference to the views of Friedman, Evan and Freeman, and Goodpaster, making sure to explain the strengths and weaknesses of their competing positions. Which approach provides the most convincing account to the social responsibilities of business? Give detailed reasons for your answer. So you've got 2 main questions there, and one kind of explanatory work. So the main 2 questions are, what moral obligations do corporations have? And then, which approach provides the most convincing account of these social responsibilities? So your thesis is there's a bit of room for movement in your thesis here, but one thesis would be potentially that, Goodpaster presents the most convincing account of, no, you wouldn't say that, would be the second part probably, it depends how you structure it, but you might say that businesses have X obligations and consequently Goodpaster gives the most convincing account. So you want to answer it in that direction. So you want to say, these are the moral obligations of businesses. So you want to set up that argument. And then you want to explore the 3, and then you'd say, well, Goodpaster makes the most sense out of this. Well, there's a million ways you could answer that. In fact, that might actually be a complicated structure. But the point is, you have to isolate one clear thesis claim. And there's 2 questions. So making sure that your thesis claim does justice to both of those questions is going to be important. but I mean it's fairly straightforward, and it gives you quite detailed ways to answer it. I would avoid against, if you're going with three sections, I wouldn't just go Friedman, Evan and Freeman, and Goodfaster, because that doesn't give you anything to evaluate. It just shows an explanation of what they're talking about. So you need to give a context for evaluating their work. So remember, if I wanted to read Friedman, I'd read Friedman. I'm reading your argument. So you're incorporating Friedman for a specific reason. So probably that is what moral obligations corporations have. Yeah, there's a lot of ways to answer that. So that should hopefully make sense. And I don't want to spend too much time on it. So question 2 is, do you agree with Weber that democracy and the good of society are threatened when some interest groups have more influence than others? Discuss this view in relation to the issue of corporate donations and corporate lobbying. Is it morally acceptable for corporations to lobby and make financial donations to governments in order to pursue privately pursued corporate ends without regard to public interest? Blah, blah, blah. So your thesis is going to be something like, well, the most direct is going to be, it is not / it is morally acceptable for corporations to lobby. And then you explain your argument for that, or you kind of unpack that thesis claim with talking about Weber. And you say, this paper will be arguing that it is morally unacceptable for corporations to, or morally acceptable for blah blah blah. In order to do this, we will explore the views of Weber, who says blah blah blah. This paper agrees / disagrees with this claim of Weber, and in order to show why, we will be discussing whatever it says in sentence 2. So the point is, thesis claim, making sure the thesis claim gets unpacked in relation to all the other questions, making sure you answer the questions, and using a thesis claim that allows you to do that. Then the important thing is going to be, how are you going to structure the argument, and consequently, how are you going to structure your paper. Trez, discuss Albert Carr's argument that business bluffing is morally permissible in relation to the debate between Arrington and Lipke on the ethics of advertising. Do you think that the kind of bluffing or puffery used in commercial advertising violates the autonomy of consumers? Defend your argument. So, the thesis claim is very simple here. It's to do with sentence 2. So, bluffing or puffery used in commercial advertising does / does not violate the autonomy of consumers. Very direct thesis claim. In order to argue this, we will be looking at Carr, Arrington, and Lipke, and doing stuff, making an argument for it. Very straightforward, that one. 4. Explain Headinger's view that the implementation of affirmative action policies in employment and other contexts does not amount to morally problematic form of reverse discrimination. Do you agree with his arguments? This paper does / does not agree with Headinger's view that blah blah blah. Then you unpack. Then you need to have an argument for what Headinger's view is. Remember, it's not just your job to explain Headinger's view. You have to do that because your thesis claim relates to Headinger. But you have to make sure that you're making an argument for the plausibility of his view. You're persuading me that Headinger is right. It's not, Headinger doesn't do that by himself. That's your job. Which means you need to tell me why it might not be plausible. Right? You need to say, this is what his view is, but it seems a bit rubbish because of the following reasons. However, for these reasons, we can see that that's not a problem and Headinger is actually great. Or whatever, however you're going to approach it. But remember, it's about persuasion. 5. What is a conflict of interest? Seems like the thesis here is going to be, a conflict of interest is X. If you answer this question, I've marked a lot of people who have answered this question. People have in the past been tempted by this question because it seems the least philosophical. It seems like you can grab an Oxford Dictionary and just define it and then just talk a lot about whatever happens in literature. Do not do that. If you are enjoying philosophy and you've got a bit of conceptual background, a conceptual analysis background, this might be a good question for you. If you're a bit nervous about philosophy, avoid this question. You have to come up with a philosophically robust definition of a conflict of interest. Or at least you have to find a philosophically robust, which means that if you look at accounting literature or whatever literature and you find one of those, it doesn't count. That's just going to be a legal definition probably. You need to come up with a philosophically robust definition and argue for the plausibility of it. Or you need to come up with your own definition and argue for that. This is not an easy question to do in 1800 words. I can't remember giving out many HDs for this answer ever. So Very good question if you're very into philosophy. Very dangerous question generally though. Alright, so 6, do you agree with Desjardins that business has a moral responsibility to ensure that activities are ecologically sustainable? So you might just say, I agree with blah blah, but you might say that your thesis claim could be simplified by saying business has a moral responsibility to ensure that activities are ecologically sustainable. This argument has been presented by Desjardins, and this paper will be presenting reasons for agreeing with it, or whatever. Examine in detail the ethical justification Desjardins gives, explain with viewers. Is he successful in his attempt to base his defense on sustainability, on etc.? Relate your discussion to the broader corporate responsibility debate, making sure you have at least 2 other sources of Desjardins. So that's just kind of hand-holding through it, telling you kind of the framework that you need to use in order to argue for the plausibility / implausibility of Desjardins' claim. Hopefully you're getting the picture now. 7. Many corporations locate manufacturing activities in countries with low labour costs and few labour laws. What ethical obligations do businesses have when operating in such countries? This paper will argue that corporations operating in countries with low labour costs and few labour laws have an ethical obligation to whatever. To pay workers a fair wage, to not coerce workers, to allow workplace conditions which do not involve harassment or harm, to whatever. Coming up with some sort of moral obligation and then giving an argument. This is kind of a very standard approach that we're used to by now. So this is question 2B in the last assessment, and this is the entirety of question 1. Sorry, in the first assessment rather. This is giving reasons for moral obligations. Such and such has a moral obligation. This is why they have a moral obligation. Very kind of, not basic, but robust kind of moral philosophy, moral reasoning philosophy. So that's the whole rubric. No, that's the whole questions. So that's half an hour. Hopefully that gives you a bit of a background, a bit of an understanding. The walkthrough of the questions isn't as important. The most important thing is that you remember that the thesis claim is paramount and your whole essay is a piece of persuasive writing. You're trying to persuade me of the thesis claim. If you don't do that, your paper's going to very much struggle. If you do that, you're halfway home. Hopefully that helps. I will be making a video on the rubric itself. It's going to be pretty quick. And it's not going to be now because it's way too windy and I'm freezing. But hopefully that helps. Do go through the essay writing guide thing I put up, my wife and I wrote. I think that's useful as well as this. So hopefully that's assisting. Any questions, the troubleshooting thing should be your first port of call. If you're not comfortable in doing that, please feel free to come to me. I'm very happy to help. Righto, thanks very much. I'll see you soon.